Imagine a wealthy man, surrounded by luxuries, who decides to test the honesty of his employees. To do this, he pretends to go bankrupt and moves to the streets, facing the harsh reality of life on the streets. For an entire year, he lives this experience, dealing with the pain of rejection and loneliness. However, amid despair, something surprising happens that will change not only his life, but also the lives of those around him. This is a story of resilience, discovery, and the transformative power of honesty. Come discover how an unexpected act can restore not only faith in humanity, but also provide a path to true wealth. If you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe and share your opinion. Billionaire Eduardo Santana has always believed that true wealth lies not in material possessions, but in the trust people place in one another. A visionary and suspicious that his wealth was surrounded by opportunists, he decided to test the loyalty of his employees in an extreme way. Without anyone knowing, Eduardo devised a radical plan to fake his own bankruptcy. He announced to everyone that he had lost everything in an unexpected financial collapse, leaving behind his empire. Without warning, he completely disappeared, going to live on the streets in torn clothes and without a penny. For an entire year, Eduardo lived as a stranger, observing the reactions of his employees and friends from afar. Without revealing his true identity, some distanced themselves, while others showed solidarity. But what he discovered at the end of this period would change not only his life, but also the lives of everyone around him. A true test of character that few expected. It was an ordinary morning in Eduardo Santana's luxurious office, where everything seemed to function as always. Phones ringing, assistants rushing to meet demands, and meetings being scheduled with major investors. But that day something was different. When Eduardo entered the conference room, everyone immediately noticed his serious and silent demeanor. The man who always exuded confidence and leadership now appeared exhausted, almost defeated. With a serious look, he stood before his top executives and, without beating around the bush, delivered news that left everyone speechless. "I have lost everything." His voice was firm, but the pain was evident in his eyes. He explained that he had risked a large part of his fortune on an investment that seemed infallible, but tragically went wrong. "All my fortune is gone," he confessed, as disbelief took hold of the room. The shock was immediate. Experienced executives, who had followed his advice for years, now looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and panic. "What will we do now?" some whispered to each other. The atmosphere, once vibrant, now seemed heavy with the weight of an impending tragedy. Eduardo continued, "The company is on the brink of bankruptcy. I don't know how we will continue." The tension in the air was palpable. Some employees, who had previously greeted him warmly, now avoided even looking in his direction. Others whispered, worried about their own jobs and the uncertain future of the company. Could it be true? How could the business genius who built an empire from scratch have fallen victim to such a colossal failure? Eduardo, maintaining control of the situation, watched the reactions closely. He knew that what was about to happen would reveal much more than any financial report could show. The plan had been set in motion, and he was about to discover who, in that critical moment, would stand genuinely by his side, and who would show their true character when the shine of money faded. Little did they know that this was all part of a grand test, planned with precision. The following days were tense. Eduardo Santana, once admired for his business acumen, now seemed to embody a defeated man. Meetings with executives became less frequent, and the atmosphere in the company, once vibrant, was now heavy with anxious whispers and suspicious glances. Some still tried to cling to hope that the billionaire might find a way out. Others, already convinced that the end was near, began to seek alternatives outside the company. Then, on a cloudy day that seemed to reflect the mood within the corporation, Eduardo called all employees to a general meeting. The room was packed, with tense looks and held breaths. He entered the room with a rigid posture, his expression graver than ever, and solemnly announced what no one wanted to hear. "Unfortunately, the situation is irreversible," he began, his voice heavy with a sorrow that seemed to come from his soul. "Without resources, I have no choice but to close the doors of the company. As of today, all of you are laid off." There was a moment of absolute silence. The shock hung in the air like an unexpected blow. Some employees lowered their heads, while others exchanged incredulous glances. The company that had been the livelihood and pride of so many was now on the brink of complete collapse. Eduardo continued, trying to maintain the dignity that remained. I know many of you have families to support and dreams that depended on this job. I am truly sorry for this. But if one day the situation changes, and I can rebuild this empire, I promise that you will be the first to be called back. You have my word. Some employees had tears in their eyes. Many respected him deeply and hoped that he, one of the greatest visionaries in the country, would find a way out. But others were already beginning to murmur, doubting his intentions and thinking about the uncertain future that awaited them. As Eduardo spoke, he carefully observed each face. He knew that this promise of priority was for some a lifeline, but for others, it sounded like an empty promise. He needed to see who would remain loyal, even in the darkest moments, and who would walk away at the first sign of difficulty. This was the true test. In the hours that followed, chaos ensued. Cardboard boxes appeared on desks as employees slowly began packing their belongings. Eduardo walked through the halls in silence, as if witnessing the end of an era. What no one knew was that he was observing. Every goodbye, every gesture of solidarity or disdain was being carefully recorded in his mind. As he watched his employees leave one by one, Eduardo knew that deep down, the greatest lesson from this test was still to come. After that fateful announcement and the closure of the company, Eduardo Santana completely vanished from the corporate scene. To many, he had simply disappeared into anonymity, unable to cope with the weight of his failure. Journalists and former colleagues tried in vain to discover his whereabouts. He, who once graced magazine covers and was a guaranteed presence at gala events, now seemed to have been swallowed by the earth. But the truth was much more surprising than any speculation. Eduardo, the billionaire who once owned mansions, luxury cars, and lived a life of extravagance, now walked the city streets like an ordinary man, concealing his true identity. Dressed in worn clothes and sporting an unkempt beard, he blended into the crowd of anonymous individuals struggling for daily survival. During the day, he wandered the sidewalks in search of work, accepting small gigs that provided just enough to get by. At night, he sought a safe corner to sleep in, sometimes on a sidewalk, other times in a crowded shelter. The glow that once surrounded his name had vanished, along with his wealth. No one could have imagined that this slow-moving man with tired eyes, who frequently asked for spare change at busy intersections, was the same Eduardo Santana who, not long ago, commanded an empire. But that was precisely the point. He did not want to be recognized. He wanted to live indeed, as an ordinary man. He wanted to understand what life was like for those who faced abandonment and indifference every single day. At first, the transition was shocking. Eduardo, who had always had everything at his disposal, now found himself grappling with the harsh reality of not having a place to sleep or food to eat. The aroma of the luxury restaurants he once frequented now twisted his empty stomach. The looks of disdain and distrust that had once been directed at others now followed him down the streets, as he tried to find refuge from the world's coldness. He met other men and women who, like him, had lost everything. Stories of broken dreams, shattered families, and missed opportunities. Conversations around makeshift campfires with those who, unlike Eduardo, had never had any other options. As the months passed, he began to grasp what it meant to live on the fringes of society. It wasn't just the lack of money or comfort, but the absence of dignity, the invisible gaze with which most people treated those at rock bottom. Life on the streets was tough, but Eduardo was determined not to give up. He forced himself to remain in this new world long enough to learn the lessons that wealth had never taught him. Hunger, cold, and loneliness, all of these were now part of his routine. Gradually, he began to transform, not only externally but internally. The arrogance and pride that had once defined his success were replaced by genuine humility, a real connection with those who, like him, were struggling to survive. Eduardo knew that this period on the streets was temporary, but he wanted to live each moment as if it were permanent. He didn't want to merely observe from a distance, like someone watching an experiment. He wanted to feel the harshness of life without privileges. He wanted to experience the reality of those without a safety net to fall back on. Months passed, and no one recognized him. Neither former employees nor business friends. He was just another anonymous face in the city. But for Eduardo, this was exactly what he needed. The opportunity to see the world from an angle that power and money had always hidden from him. And as he lived this new reality, he observed closely. He knew that the day he would reveal his true identity would come. But that day was not yet near. There were more lessons to be learned, more stories to be heard, and more tests to be taken. Throughout the months, Eduardo experienced firsthand the severity and solidarity of the world he had always ignored from his lofty office. Each day brought a new lesson, and every corner of the city held a new story. He began to understand the true struggle for survival, far removed from the protection of glass walls and the comfort of leather chairs in his old office. Mornings began early, not by choice but by necessity, as he sought a safe place to rest. Eduardo woke before the sun rose, when the streets were still shrouded in darkness. He dragged himself from his makeshift corner, always in search of a hot cup of coffee or a piece of bread. One day, passing by a bakery, he noticed the baker throwing away unsold bread. Without a second thought, Eduardo approached and asked if he could take some. The baker, surprised to see a well-dressed man at such a desperate moment, hesitated but eventually relented. The feeling of holding those warm loaves of bread in his hands was both humiliating and liberating. He felt the soft texture, the smell of wheat, and the life he was about to consume. That simple act of generosity, which he had never noticed before, meant more than mere food. It was a sign that solidarity still existed, even in the most difficult circumstances. Eduardo also met Maria, a middle-aged woman who slept in a homeless shelter. She had a warm smile, despite the sadness in her eyes. Every day, Maria shared stories of her youth, about how she had once been a promising artist until life took her down unexpected paths. The way she spoke about art, music, and hope inspired Eduardo. He remembered his own life, the coldness of numbers and emotionless meetings. Maria's passion for what she once loved made Eduardo realize how much he had lost by becoming consumed by materialism. As they spent time together, Eduardo began to understand the realities of the people around him. He observed the small interactions, the way homeless individuals helped each other, sharing blankets or a bit of food. On one of the coldest days of winter, he saw a group of men sharing a bottle of hot coffee. They laughed and told stories, and for a brief moment, the harsh reality seemed to dissipate. Eduardo stood still, watching that act of friendship that disarmed him. He realized that, even amid pain, there was an unbreakable bond between those who had lost everything. The contrast between the harshness of daily life and the resilience of the people he met became a constant reflection in his mind. On the hardest days, Eduardo felt the loneliness and despair trying to overpower him. But there was always a glimmer of hope that emerged in unexpected moments. One afternoon, while walking through the streets, he stumbled upon a community event in a park. People of all ages gathered to share food, music, and stories. Eduardo approached hesitantly, but soon he was welcomed by a group that invited him to join them. The warmth of human interaction enveloped him, and he realized he was not alone in his struggle. That day was a turning point. Over the months, Eduardo not only learned about the severity of life on the streets, but also about the extraordinary strength of community. He began to actively participate in solidarity efforts, helping to distribute food and clothing to those in need. These interactions not only helped him understand the value of empathy, but also awakened in him a new purpose. He wanted in some way to give back to those who had taught him so much. The billionaire who once viewed the world only through numbers and profits, now looked at the people around him with new understanding. He began to see the beauty in small things, a smile, a kind word, a gesture of goodwill. These moments, which had previously gone unnoticed in his life of luxury, were now the most valuable experiences he had. Eduardo knew that the journey was not yet over, but he was ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. He had learned that true wealth was not in possessions, but in the connections we form, and the ability to touch the lives of others. And so, as the seasons changed, Eduardo also transformed, adapting to the new life he had never imagined. As he wandered the streets, Eduardo found generosity in strangers, who without hesitation offered him a smile, a hot coffee, or a blanket when the night's cold became unbearable. There was something comforting in the kindness emanating from people who, like him, faced their own battles. These interactions, though simple, began to touch his heart in ways he had never imagined. One morning, while walking along one of the busy avenues in the city, Eduardo crossed paths with a group of people organizing a food distribution. He hesitated before approaching, but the smell of fresh bread and the contagious laughter of children drew him in. One of the volunteers, an elderly lady with gray hair and bright eyes, spotted him and, with a warm smile, offered him a slice of bread and some soup. "You look like you need something to warm your body and soul," she said, and Eduardo, touched by her generosity, accepted gratefully. These encounters became more frequent, but what surprised him the most was when, on a rainy afternoon, he came across Carlos, one of the young men who worked at the reception of his former company. Eduardo did not make himself known immediately. His unkempt appearance and scruffy beard made him almost unrecognizable. Carlos, with his worried gaze and tired expression, was distributing food to the homeless. Carlos was a hard-working young man, always enthusiastic and dedicated. He had dreams of becoming a manager, but reality had been tough. He juggled temporary jobs, working long hours to support his family. Eduardo knew this because he had seen Carlos tirelessly dedicate himself, even in the most challenging situations. Now the young man was there in the rain, helping those in need. As Carlos served soup to a group of people, Eduardo remained silent, watching. The young man looked visibly tired, but his determination and compassion shone in his eyes. He smiled and spoke to each person who approached, treating them with a respect that Eduardo would never forget. In that moment, Eduardo felt a pang in his heart. He wanted to shout. He wanted Carlos to know who he truly was, but he hesitated, consumed by shame and the new reality he lived in. Finally, Carlos turned and looked at him, his expression softening when he noticed a man sitting on the ground, wrapped in a tattered blanket. "Hey buddy, come warm yourself. We have food," Carlos said, unaware that he was speaking to his former boss. Carlos's gesture, despite his own difficulties, revealed the true essence of human compassion. Eduardo felt a wave of emotion, as if life was testing him at every turn. After hesitating, Eduardo accepted Carlos's offer. He sat down beside him, and as he received the hot soup, he saw a glimmer of hope in the young man's eyes. "Thank you," Eduardo murmured, his voice hoarse and choked. Carlos smiled, confused but happy to help. "Don't worry, buddy. We're all in this together. One day, things will get better," Carlos replied, unaware of the impact his words had. For Eduardo, it was as if each word was a light in the darkness. He began to realize that kindness knew no bounds. It could appear where least expected, even in the darkest situations. Throughout the weeks, Eduardo continued to meet with Carlos and other former employees, who, even without recognizing him, showed compassion and empathy. Each encounter was a new lesson, a new opportunity for Eduardo to reflect on his former life and what truly mattered. He observed how people struggled, but also how they came together, forming bonds of solidarity that transcended social barriers. These moments changed Eduardo forever, giving him a new perspective on life and the true meaning of community. He realized that generosity was not just about giving something material, but also about offering a piece of oneself, a bit of love and understanding, especially in times of need. This new vision prepared him for a return, a transformation that he still could not imagine, but that was forming within him, one day at a time. 1 year had passed since Eduardo's false bankruptcy, and the city around him continued its frantic routine. The seasons changed, bringing with them the blossoming of spring, the warmth of summer, the falling leaves of autumn, and the chill of winter. But for Eduardo, each day had been a microcosm of transformation and learning. He had been shaped by the experiences that life on the streets had offered him, like clay taking shape in the hands of a sculptor. At first, time seemed to drag on. The days were long and filled with uncertainties. Eduardo remembered moments when he wondered if he would truly be able to withstand the pressure and despair that street life imposed. He woke up every day with the hope of finding a new purpose, but often, discouragement threatened to take over. However, gradually, the lessons he learned from strangers became part of his new identity. On a sunny morning, Eduardo decided it was time to reinvent himself. He began to roam the streets in search of new opportunities. With the warmth of the sunlight caressing his face, he passed through parks and busy corners, talking to people and sharing his own experiences. The young man who had once been a billionaire now saw himself as a storyteller, and his narratives about resilience and overcoming adversity quickly began to resonate with those who listened. One afternoon, while sitting on a park bench, he noticed a group of young people organizing a community event. They were collecting clothes and food for the less fortunate. Eduardo approached, eager to help. As soon as he offered to collaborate, one of the young women, Anna, looked at him with a curious expression. "Have you done this before?" she asked, assessing him. Eduardo smiled, without revealing his true identity, and replied, "Actually, I learned the importance of helping others. That's all that matters now." Anna's empathy and generosity touched him deeply, and he decided to join them. In the following days, Eduardo worked tirelessly, not only helping to organize the event, but also sharing his experiences. He spoke with participants about the strength of community, how unity could transform lives. For him, each small act of kindness and each connection he formed was a step towards something greater. Meanwhile, winter approached, and with it came the need to warm not only the body but also the heart. Eduardo recalled the nights he slept outdoors, the hardships he faced, and the challenges he overcame. But he also remembered the laughter he shared with others who, like him, faced their struggles. These memories motivated him to do more than just survive. He wanted to make a difference in the lives of the people he met. One night, while distributing blankets at a shelter, he encountered Carlos again. The young man was still juggling temporary jobs to support his family. Upon seeing him, Eduardo felt a warmth in his heart. Carlos had always been an example of determination and kindness. They talked at length, and Eduardo realized that, despite the difficulties, Carlos maintained an optimistic spirit. "You're an inspiration, you know," said Carlos, unaware he was speaking to his former boss. Eduardo smiled, touched by the young man's humility and strength. The year of challenges and rediscoveries took Eduardo to places he had never imagined. The city, which had once been merely a backdrop to his luxurious life, was now a vibrant home filled with stories and struggles. He had become part of the fabric of that community, a vital piece that wove together the experiences of others into a narrative of hope. As the anniversary of his false bankruptcy approached, Eduardo reflected on how everything had changed. He was no longer the billionaire who only cared about numbers and profits. He was a man who had found a greater purpose, a calling to serve and inspire. What had once been a sign of failure had now become an opportunity for a fresh start. With a heart full of gratitude and a mind brimming with new ideas, Eduardo began planning a community event to celebrate his journey and what he had learned throughout the year. He wanted to create a space where people could share their stories, support one another, and find strength in unity. He dreamed of making that event a landmark of transformation, not only for himself, but for all those who crossed his path. The year was coming to an end, but Eduardo's journey was just beginning. He knew that challenges would still come, but now, instead of facing them alone, he had a community by his side. He had found himself, and in doing so, he had also discovered the power of resilience and compassion that existed in the human heart. After a year immersed in challenges and self-discovery, Eduardo decided it was time to return. He had transformed, not only because of the experiences he had lived, but also due to the deep connection he had established with the people around him. However, the idea of returning to his old life was not simple. He felt he needed to do it the right way, without the artifices he used to rely on, but with an open and honest heart. On a sunny spring morning, Eduardo put on a suit that still fit him, but now it had a different air. No longer an armor of status, but clothing that symbolized a new beginning. He looked at his reflection in the mirror, observing the changes in his face, the lines of expression that now told stories of overcoming and resilience. With a deep sigh, he headed to his old company, the building that once represented everything he had achieved, but now also symbolized what he had lost. Upon entering the lobby, he felt a mix of nostalgia and anxiety. The space was the same, with its gleaming glass walls and sophisticated decor that had always surrounded him. But at the same time, everything seemed distant. He realized that, even in those moments of grandeur, true wealth lay in human interactions, in the connections he had neglected. Eduardo requested a meeting with the team, who quickly gathered in the conference room. The faces of his former colleagues lit up upon seeing him, but the joy was accompanied by surprise and concern. They remembered the last time they had seen him, when he declared that everything was lost. Now before them, he appeared to be the same magnate they had known, but there was something different in his gaze, a depth that had not existed before. "Thank you for being here," Eduardo began, his voice choked with emotion. "I know my absence left many of you worried. Today, I come not only to explain, but to share something that changed my life. What I did over the past year was a journey of transformation, and it is something I want all of you to understand." He paused, looking into the eyes of each of his former colleagues, observing the mix of confusion and expectation. "I left to experience life in another way, away from the wealth that surrounded me. I wanted to understand what it is like to live without everything I had. And the truth is that I learned more than I could ever imagine. I found a sense of community and solidarity that I had never known before." Murmurs began to arise in the room, and Eduardo continued, "Yes, I lost everything. But more importantly, I gained everything. I found people who showed me what it means to be human, what it means to help each other in difficult times. And for that, I am no longer the broken man you knew. I am a renewed man." He took a deep breath before revealing the truth he had kept for so long. "The company never really closed. I was testing all of your honesty. I wanted to see who would stand by my side, who would care not just about financial success, but about the mission and vision we all created together. And more importantly, I wanted to find my true self, someone who could lead with empathy and understanding." The room was silent, and Eduardo could see understanding beginning to emerge on the faces of his former employees. He felt a deeper connection with them, as if each person were recalling their own struggles and victories. "Now, I am here to reclaim my position in the company, but not just as a magnate. I want to be a leader who has learned to value each of you and the importance of working together. I want us all to rebuild this company, not just as a business, but as a community of support and respect." The atmosphere in the room changed drastically. A wave of emotions washed over those present. Some were incredulous, while others were moved. But as Eduardo finished speaking, spontaneous applause echoed off the walls of the room. The clapping was not just a recognition of his courage in returning, but a celebration of the new era that was about to begin. Eduardo felt tears of joy streaming down his face. He knew he was no longer alone. He was now part of something much larger than himself. The connection he had formed with those around him, the empathy he had cultivated on the streets, was now transforming into a force that would propel him into the future. With a renewed heart and the determination to build something real, Eduardo was ready to lead again. He had found his mission, and from that day forward, the company would become a beacon of hope and solidarity, reflecting everything he had learned on his journey. Life, like the city, was in constant flux, and he was ready to navigate this new reality, now as a man who not only had wealth, but also a purpose. After Eduardo's revelation about his journey and his return to the company, a new chapter was about to unfold. He knew he needed to do more than simply reclaim his position. He wanted his return to mean something greater, a true rebirth for both himself and everyone around him. Eduardo decided that the new leadership of the company should reflect not only his own experiences, but also the values he now considered fundamental. Among those who extended a helping hand during his time on the streets, Carlos stood out as a brilliant example of empathy and honesty. Eduardo always knew that, despite his struggles, Carlos had a generous heart and an indomitable spirit. He observed the young man during the food drive event and saw how he connected with people, listening to their stories and offering genuine support. The way Carlos treated each individual with dignity and respect was something Eduardo wished to see multiplied within the company. On a clear and vibrant morning, Eduardo called a meeting with the entire team to share his renewed vision and make a special announcement. He sat at the conference table, surrounded by familiar and curious faces. The atmosphere was charged with expectation and a bit of tension. Everyone was eager to hear what Eduardo had to say after his return. When he began to speak, silence filled the room like an electric current, all eyes fixed on him, ready to absorb his words. I want each of you to know that during my absence, I learned that a man's true wealth is not in his bank account, but in the way he relates to others, in his ability to put himself in someone else's shoes. Eduardo began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. And so today, I have the honor of inviting Carlos to take on a prominent position within the company. He embodies the values that I want our organization to represent. Murmurs began to arise in the room. Carlos, who was among the newest employees, was surprised and for a moment couldn't process what was happening. He looked at Eduardo in disbelief, his eyes wide, and the expression of someone who did not expect to be recognized in such a way. What he felt in that moment was a mix of pride and a dose of humility. Eduardo continued, Carlos not only showed me what it means to be generous and supportive, but also how crucial it is to lead with heart. He is someone who has always been willing to help others, even when facing his own challenges. And that is the quality we need in our leadership team. The silence in the room was now filled with emotion. Carlos, still dazed, stood up, a little hesitant, but with a glimmer of determination in his eyes. He looked at Eduardo and then at his colleagues, who watched him with a mix of respect and admiration. This is a great challenge for me, Carlos began, his voice slightly trembling. But I am honored and determined to make a difference here, not only for the company but for each one of you. I believe that together we can build an environment where everyone feels valued and heard. The atmosphere changed radically when Carlos began to speak. The expressions on his colleagues' faces shifted from skepticism to hope. He shared not only his dreams, but also the vision of a company that cared not just about profits but about people. Carlos's words resonated throughout the room, echoing the message Eduardo had tried to convey. The meeting transformed into a dynamic conversation where ideas were shared freely. Employees began discussing how they could implement changes that reflected the new values of the company, each bringing suggestions and experiences that would enrich the organizational culture. Eduardo felt the vibrant energy in the room, as if new life was being breathed into the company. Empathy, honesty, and solidarity became the pillars of what the organization would become. Eduardo realized he was not just assembling a team, but creating a family united by a greater purpose. He saw that the change he wanted to initiate was not just about him, but the opportunity to transform every life present. As the meeting came to an end, a wave of enthusiasm swept over everyone. Carlos, now invested in his new position, was the symbol of hope and potential that existed in each of them. He had become a beacon of light, a reminder that, even in the most challenging situations, a man's true wealth lies in his ability to reach out and make a difference in the lives of others. As Eduardo left the room, he smiled at Carlos, who was surrounded by colleagues discussing plans and ideas. He knew that together they would be ready to face any challenges the future might bring, always guided by empathy and the strength of the community they had built. The company was no longer just a business structure. It was a space for growth, learning, and transformation, where each individual was valued, and where true wealth would flourish in every action and choice made. When the meeting came to a close, Eduardo and Carlos met again, now in a more intimate moment. Carlos, with a sparkle in his eyes, expressed his gratitude. "Thank you, Eduardo. You gave me an opportunity one never thought I would have. I want everyone here to know that, for me, true success will not only be the company's growth, but also how we can support and inspire each other." Eduardo nodded, moved. He knew that true change does not happen overnight, but this was the beginning of a new era. From now on, the company would not just be a workplace, but a home where the human values of empathy, honesty, and solidarity would always take center stage. And so, on that day, As the team members left the room with smiles on their faces and a renewed sense of purpose, Eduardo and Carlos understood that true wealth was not in possessions, but in the power of human connections. Their journey, marked by challenges and triumphs, was now intertwined with the destinies of all the employees. Together, they were ready to build not just a successful company, but a united and resilient community where everyone could shine and thrive. Everyone in that room began to realize that, beyond being a test of honesty, the experience Eduardo had provided them was a powerful reflection on what truly mattered in life. The atmosphere had changed, and the air became charged with a deep and almost tangible understanding. As the employees shared their stories and experiences, the realization that true wealth was not measured merely by material goods, but by values, connections, and human experiences began to resonate throughout the room. Eduardo's journey had not only challenged their beliefs about success, but had also encouraged them to look within themselves and reevaluate their own priorities. In one corner of the room, Anna, an employee who had always dedicated herself to overtime, began to share her story. When I heard about the company's bankruptcy, I was terrified. I worked so much because I believed that more hours meant more security. But reflecting now, I realize I lost precious moments with my family. I was so focused on securing the future that I almost forgot to live in the present, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The room fell silent, and Anna's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Everyone there could relate to her struggle. The feeling that work should not be the only priority in their lives spread like a wave, making each person feel vulnerable, but also strengthened. Carlos, listening to Anna's words, stood up again. I went through the same thing. When I was struggling to support my family with temporary jobs, I often felt trapped in an endless cycle of stress and pressure. But while living on the streets, I learned that everyone I met had a story, a struggle, and a unique light. It made me realize that, despite the hardships, what truly matters is how we support each other. I want our company to reflect that. Empathy spread through the room, and employees began to recall moments when small acts of kindness had changed their day. The young receptionist, Lucia, shared how, on a particularly difficult day, a colleague helped her carry heavy boxes during an event. That simple gesture made me feel seen and appreciated. I realized that even in a corporate environment, we are all human beings, and we need each other. As the stories continued to flow, Eduardo realized that what began as an attempt to test his employees' honesty had transformed into a deep collective reflection on what truly mattered. He felt grateful for having had the courage to embark on that journey, for now, he was seeing the beauty that emerged from the difficult experiences he had faced. Every word shared resonated with the feeling that the corporate world could be more than just numbers and goals. It could be a place of growth, support, and love. Eduardo smiled, knowing that the real transformation was happening right there before him. The company was no longer just a structure, but a vibrant community that genuinely cared about each other's well-being. In that moment, the past of each individual began to be rewritten. The experiences that were once seen merely as hardships were now understood as opportunities for growth and connection. The group realized that, regardless of their positions, everyone was essential to the team's success. As the meeting came to an end, the feeling of unity and purpose was palpable. Eduardo, watching the room, felt emotional as he saw how each of his employees was engaged in building a future together, a future that reflected the human values he held dear. As people stood up, the smiles were more than just simple expressions of happiness. They were silent promises that, together, they could face any challenge. Eduardo had created a new organizational culture, where empathy and honesty were the foundation of everything they would do. He knew that as they looked toward the future, they were not only preparing for financial success, but more importantly, they were ready to build a legacy of humanity that could impact not only their lives, but also the lives of everyone around them. And so, on that memorable day, Eduardo and his team embarked on a journey of discovery and growth, armed with the certainty that true wealth was not in their bank accounts, but in the relationships they cultivated and the lives they impacted. The transformation was only just beginning, and the promise of a more empathetic and supportive future echoed in every heart present in that room, like an echo that would never cease. Eduardo and his team's journey reminds us that true wealth is not measured in material goods, but in the connections and mutual support we cultivate. In times of difficulty, it is human values that guide and strengthen us. Did you like this inspiring story? Share your thoughts in the comments and like the video. Together, let's spread the message of empathy and solidarity. Your voice matters.